let us know in the chat. Okay, so my name is Emily Bauman. I'm the Communications Associate at the St. Louis Community Foundation. So first, I'd just like to take a quick second to introduce today's presenters, and then I'll pass it off to them and we will get started. Today's training, as you can see, is writing a winning grant, writing a successful grant. It's presented by the wonderful community investment team at the St. Louis Community Foundation. Elizabeth George is our Director of Community Investment. Elizabeth joined the St. Louis Community Foundation in 2018, and she has over 20 years experience in the philanthropic sector. Her role is to connect community and donors, whether individuals, families, private foundations, or institutional funders. In community, Elizabeth identifies mission-aligned initiatives or issues and determines how the Community Foundation can support those efforts. Nikki Martinez, Community Investment Manager, is a social worker and nonprofit professional with over 15 years of experience. She brings expertise of the nonprofit sector to her work as a grant maker and works to stay educated about the local nonprofit landscape, support organizations in their efforts to connect to the Community Foundation, and assist donors to achieve their philanthropic visions. Last but not least is Emily Seiple, Community Investment Assistant. She joined the Community Foundation last year in 2021 and has over 5 years of nonprofit program management and local policy development experience. She enjoys learning from nonprofit leaders in St. Louis while providing research and day-to-day operation support for the Foundation's grant-making and community initiatives. All right, so we're pretty much ready to get started. There is going to be a question and answer session after the training, so please feel free to ask questions in the chat. Nikki, take it away. Oh, you're muted, Nikki.
Yeah, sorry. Sometimes when I share screen, I'm like, where am I clicking? Thank you, Emily, for those awesome introductions. You make us sound so knowledgeable about the nonprofit sector, which I think we are. And we're not just knowledgeable. I think we are real lovers of the nonprofit sector. And I think that that's the best way to start this training, because we really want to emphasize that, this is here. These sorts of resources are here to support you in the community and help you do the best work possible. So before we begin, we're going to ask you, now that you know about us, if you could in the chat give us a little information about you. I think there's quite a few people on the call today, so the chat might be a little crowded, but we would love to hear from you as far as your name, your organization, and what questions you have brought today to the table that you want to have answered, so that we can make sure to address those. And just in advance, so you know, if you do have any very specific questions to your organization or to a specific grant, we might not answer those today, but we will follow up with you and we'll make sure to give you some one-on-one time to answer those questions that are specific to your organization. So let's get started. What is grant making? I think that this is asked a lot, and I think there's a lot of confusion about, how grant making kind of works. And we like to look at things with a little bit of humor on our team. So we put together these memes for everyone. We really see very often that people kind of think of grant writing like it's a science, like there is some sort of formula that if you follow that formula, you will get funded. We wish that was the case, but unfortunately, there's a lot of factors at play when we are helping our donors make decisions. So it really isn't a science. It is an art. It is an art form. We are asking to see your happy little trees, and we are excited to see your happy little trees and learn more about what your landscape looks like. And sometimes that might look a little bit like off formula. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but hopefully this is a good way to start. Humor, I think, is always a good way to start anything. So first we'll talk about our role at the Community Foundation, and then we'll take a little look at what the grant making looks around the St. Louis region beyond what we do here at the St. Louis Community Foundation. We'll also go into some basics about writing a grant, specifically not just related to the Missouri Common Grant, but grant writing in general. And of course, we'll leave some time for questions and answers at the end. And please, we welcome questions all throughout the chat. Somebody will be monitoring that while I'm speaking and while we're all taking turns. So let's talk a little bit more about the St. Louis Community Foundation role. Our mission at the St. Louis Community Foundation is to encourage purposeful philanthropy that connects community and donors to build and preserve a more equitable and vibrant region now and forever. That is a very complicated way of saying that we are here to connect our donors to the things that give them joy and make their philanthropy really meaningful to them and to their families and to their values. And it's something that I really love doing. And I know I speak for the rest of my team in saying that it's just a joy for us to be able to connect people to things that make them happy and invest in the community in ways that they think are going to be impactful. We have a lot, the Community Foundation has several buckets full of money we like to kind of describe, but we're going to talk today about those competitive grant making options because that's really sort of the bread and butter of that grant writing. Competitive grant making is how we really refer internally to a program where you're going to write a grant and you're going to get funded or not get funded, but there is an application involved. It's a little bit more involved, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more in a moment. But these are the various competitive grant making opportunities that we have. Within our donor advised funds, most of our donor advised funds, we like to say are DIY. They are not engaging in that competitive grant making space. They're not asking for applications. They're really going out in the community themselves, seeing what makes them happy and where their values lie and making those donations. We're always here to provide any information that they need, offer any insight that they might need, but again, they're mostly DIY. But we do have some of those donors within our donor advised fund family that really want to go deeper with their giving, and they do go into those competitive grant making processes. And same with the field of interest funds. We have a few that just want to go a little bit deeper and get those applications. The pooled and partnership funds, those are not exclusive to the Community Foundation. That's when we call on our friends in the funding community, which we'll talk about who those are a little bit in a minute. But we call upon our friends when we see a problem and we say, hey, we can't solve this together, or we can't solve this alone, but together we might be able to make an impact. Some really good examples of that are the Census Fund, which was back in 2020. We worked with several foundations and nonprofits around the community to make sure some funds were distributed to make the census successful, or as successful as it could be in the pandemic. Another really good example would be the Welcome Fund, which came together as a result of the influx of Afghan and refugees from other places coming to St. Louis to make this community their home. And how can we support them? So we brought together some of our funding partners to pool some funds together and make some grants, which was a lot of fun for us. And then, of course, our private foundation and grant making programs. So that is essentially where the Community Foundation doesn't own the assets. We don't hold those assets here at our office. They are held elsewhere, but we are essentially the back office for some private and family foundations around the community that are managing their own funds. And we'll get into those in a little bit. So these are the types of grants. We really like to break it down pretty simply as far as what those look like. We have a lot of grant making that is done directly from our donors' funds, as I just talked about, directly from a donor advised fund. And that's about 70% of what we're doing. They have a lot of autonomy. Generally, there's not an application or any sort of reporting involved in that. It's really more about stewarding a donor and that basic relationship building. The competitive grants is where we get, again, much deeper. It's used by all of our private and family foundations and those pooled funds, as we talked about. There is a required application that will look different across every single one of these programs, which is also important to note. Each one of them is looking for something different to know about those organizations before they fund them. And then most of them are marketed publicly. Some of them are by invite, but we do have them listed on our website in case organizations have any questions and want to understand what that entry point looks like. These are competitive grants from our St. Louis Community Foundation funds. The Charles Foundation is currently open. That's a grant making process that happens once every year, always in the fourth quarter. And the focus is very hyper focused on older adults living in South City and South County. We work with an advisory committee to distribute these funds as the Charles Foundation has outlined within their trust documents. And again, it's open now. And if anyone has any questions about that, it is due October 12th. So there's still time, and we're happy to answer individual questions on that later. The Gateway Regional Environmental Fund is kind of our environmental baby. We don't really have a lot of other environmental causes within our competitive grant making. So this one, we always say we get the most interesting applications. I've learned so much about carbon reduction and various efforts around the community because of this process. And the way that it works is that the donors have an LOI that comes out once a year, and they designed it themselves to say, hey, what are your ideas? We want to hear all of them. Just throw them all out to us. And then we will help you decide if any of those make any sense for our grant making process. The Guy B. Jaffe and Judy Schwartz Jaffe Charitable Fund is a mouthful. We refer to it as the Jaffe Fund. They are a lovely family that are, again, getting deeper. They've been with the Community Foundation for quite some time. They've had a donor advised fund, but they just really wanted to do more with it. And they came to us and they said, let's throw out a net and see what happens. And we've had so much fun working with them because they really do get to experience that joy in their giving and get to know organizations that they probably would never have met otherwise. And finally, the Spirit of St. Louis Women's Fund, which a lot of you are familiar with. There are, within our family of donor advised funds and field of interest funds, they are probably the most unique. It is not a family or a board or advisory committee that's making these decisions. It's a giving circle. So there's about 200 or plus women that are all volunteers, all pay into this fund, and yearly they get together to review applications and proposals and make decisions of who they're going to fund. I always say that this one is a hard one to get funded through because they get a lot of applications, but it can be a really good place to make friends because within that 200 membership number, you really don't know who's going to read your application. And these are all philanthropically minded women in the community. They're doing this work because they really love it. These are some examples of our pooled and partnership funds that I talked about. None of these are open currently, but I think these are all really good examples of why our newsletter and signing up for our newsletter is so important. Every single one of these kind of came out of thin air almost for us. You know, they were not things that are static that we're doing every year or every quarter, like some of our other competitive grants. These are things that have popped up as a result of something that's happened around the world or a funding that was made available through another entity. Something has happened and those funds have come to us, and we've called upon our friends to help us either make that pool larger and distribute those funds. Again, none of these are open, but they're all really good examples of those partnership funds that we've had. These are the private and family foundation grant programs that we represent. Again, these are the families and private foundations that don't hold their assets with us. We are essentially their office. We're their employees. We are here to support their entire giving process and their grant making. That includes any inquiries, the applications, in some cases, site visits, correspondence with nonprofits. These are some of the bigger names, I think, that we hear a little bit more in the community. I always hear the Burgess Family Foundation name when we're out. They are a bit of a bigger name, and they do rely on us to help be their funnel, so to speak, in terms of those inquiries. Both the Pettis and Burgess Family Foundations accept applications by invite. We're happy to talk to you about what that process looks like individually based on their priorities if you think you might be a fit. The Episcopal Presbyterian Health Trust is publicly posted. Currently, they are not accepting applications any longer for 2022. And the board is actually in a process of strategic planning. Just they have seen an increasing number of applications. And we want to make sure that they're making the impact that the trust has set out. So we've used this whole year to do strategic planning, and we hope to have decisions about what 2023 giving will look like in fourth quarter, and we will get that out widely. So within our newsletters, we will probably email you guys individually. If you do have questions about that, be on the lookout for those emails. And if you don't get anything from us by, I'd say mid to late December, call us, and we are happy to point you in the right direction. So beyond the landscape of the Community Foundation, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to turn this over to EG, I believe. I got carried away. So I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth George to talk a little bit more beyond Community Foundation work.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Nikki, for setting the stage, and welcome to all of you that are here with us today. We're very happy to have you. As Nikki said, we wanted to talk a little bit about what grant making in general across the country and a little bit specifically around St. Louis looks like. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll set the stage. So every year, the Philanthropy Institute at Indiana University publishes Giving USA, and it's an annual report on giving in the United States or throughout the United States. And you all may have seen this, those of you that attended the Rome Group's Philanthropic Landscape, you've seen these numbers before. But the big news here is that in 2021, Americans gave $485 billion to nonprofit organizations, $485 billion. That is a whole lot of money. But what's really critical to be thinking about here is when you look at how that money is given, 67% comes from individuals, and 10% comes from bequests. And bequests are basically individuals who have identified nonprofits in their wills. So really, we're talking about 77% or more than 3/4 of funding or of philanthropic gifts come from individuals. About 19% comes from foundations and about 4% from corporations. So when we're thinking about grant writing, it's really that 19% and 4% that we're talking about. It's 23% of the total. It's not where the majority of dollars are coming from. One thing I would say though is that sector by sector, that shifts a little bit. And so you may find that in health and human services, more comes from grant writing than say, not your big research institutions, but high schools and churches and places like that, where a lot of individual donations come from. So oftentimes you want to be thinking about those individual gifts as well as your grant writing. The other thing is grants typically come with some restrictions. Individual gifts oftentimes are more likely to be unrestricted gifts. So, okay, if we go on, we'll talk about some different types of foundations. So we've broken it out here in kind of 3 different levels. So the first line that you see there, private foundations, family foundations, corporate foundations, those are all independent foundations with their own grant-making boards. So they'll have their own board of trustees or board of directors and their own efforts and initiatives that each one of them will be interested in. So private foundations typically are more like the Episcopal Presbyterian Health Trust that Nikki talked about, where it isn't a family that's making the decision, it is a board of trustees that is made up of independent bodies. Family foundations are private foundations, but typically, the majority of seats on newer family foundations are held by family members. Once you get into, fourth, fifth generation, you may still see majority of family members, but you will also likely see other community partners brought onto that board. I think a good example of this is the Ford Foundation, which is a family foundation. There is still Ford family representation on that board, but the majority of the board are not family members, as opposed to the Batterot Foundation here in St. Louis, where the family still controls that board. Corporate foundations, somebody had asked in the chat the difference between corporate grants and corporate sponsorships. Corporate foundations are the ones that will make grants. Corporate foundations typically are making grants that are in kind of the areas of interest that align with the work of that for-profit business. They tend to be independent from the corporation. They oftentimes have their own endowment, or they will be fed from earnings from the corporation. There may be some overlap on board members. Typically, there is some overlap on board members, but they are independent of that corporation. They're separately incorporated. And here is where you will apply for grants. It's typically for corporate foundations. If you pop down to the other institutional giving, you see corporate giving programs there. Sometimes those are grant programs, but oftentimes also the corporate sponsorships come out of these other corporate giving programs, oftentimes tied again to their marketing, that there would be some cause-related function with that sponsorship. Oftentimes it's a completely different type of application that you're filling out there. It's much more about the sponsor, about the event, than it is about the work of the organization. So that's a little bit about independent foundations and the difference between corporate foundations and corporate giving programs. Community foundations like ours are 501c3 organizations that make grants for charitable purposes, typically in specific communities or regions. We tend to be place-based. Funds come from many different areas. Funds can come from donors that like the donor advised funds Nikki mentioned earlier. That's where you will see funds that might go outside of the St. Louis area. Sometimes community foundations have endowments. We have a little bit, but those are funds that can be used on a discretionary basis. They tend to support some of those pooled funds that Nikki talked about. And others, other types of funds are oftentimes independently administered by the people who developed that fund. An example would be Charles Foundation, where we hold those assets, but there is an advisory board that stemmed from the board of the Charles home when it was operating, and they're the ones who make the ultimate decisions about where those grants would go. Federated giving programs, those are like the United Way or the Jewish Federation, where multiple people are giving to an organization that will then make the decisions about where those grants will go or where those dollars will go. And it's a great way for people who don't know as much about nonprofits, aren't interested in sort of digging in to who to give to know that their money is being, or that nonprofits are being vetted and that their money is being used well. Okay, so from there we'll go to the next slide. So we wanted to just give you a taste of some local private foundations, some with different missions. You'll see across the board a variety of different foundations here in the St. Louis area. So there's Missouri Foundation for Health, which funds in 86 counties, and the city of St. Louis is one of those 86 counties. And they're focused on health and improving the systems of health for all people. The Gateway Foundation, their focus is acquiring, creating, and improving tangible and durable art and urban design. The Tillis Foundation, they look at children with developmental, intellectual, and physical disabilities, as well as K through 16 education. MFH, Deaconess Foundation, Incarnate Word, they're all health conversion foundations. So they all tie back to health at some level, and they work in different ways. So Incarnate Word Foundation is really focused on sort of community development as a social determinant of health. Deaconess Foundation is looking at child advocacy and health advocacy with the thought that if we can improve conditions for kids, we'll improve conditions for the health of the community. We also have a number of local family foundations here in St. Louis. Here is just a spattering of these. The Trulasky Family Foundation, the Trio Foundation, Rob Lee Foundation. And somebody asked how to research funding that aligns with their mission, how to find grants that align with the mission. And, I think there are a couple of different ways to do that. I always like to say that starting at the St. Louis Public Library, the downtown library, they have the Center for Grants and Foundations. I think that's the right name. And there's a staff there at the Center for Grants and Foundations that will help you look into your mission and who aligns with your mission. They'll help you think about how to approach a different funder. They're just a really wonderful resource for our community. So if you're new to grants research, that is a fantastic way to start. The other thing is, I always look at who is funding other organizations that have similar missions to mine. I don't, and think about what, and then research the foundations that are funding in those areas, get on their website and spend a little time figuring out who's doing what. That's a great way to do some research around who's funding in your area. Okay, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some grant writing basics. Excuse me. So if we go to the next slide. As you're looking, as you're researching, what you want to be doing is making sure that you're investigating or you're applying to foundations whose interest, whose priority areas, whose initiatives match your need and match your mission. And it's where that alignment comes, where that foundation will invest in your organization. That's really the secret sauce there, is to find that good alignment. And once you do that, your job becomes much, much easier. I'm going to turn it over now, actually, to Emily Seiple, who will talk a little bit about the nonprofit grant cycle, and then from there, lead you through applying for grants.
Awesome, thank you. And just kind of an aside to my team, I have been admitting people. If anyone else can take that over, just in case, I don't believe in my multitasking at this time. So, okay, so I kind of wanted to, I wanted to start by kind of modeling something I'm going to bring up a couple slides from now, which is being transparent about where you are. And so I used to be a grant writer for a very tiny nonprofit, not in our community, but in Minnesota. And in that role, I was also a live-in manager for a transitional housing program. And so that is a very small scope of grant writing experience, but I say that so that you know that whatever I have gained from that and my role at the Community Foundation, I'm here to share. And also just to say that I understand grant writers are wearing a lot of hats, and our team understands that you're wearing a lot of hats. And so if you don't take anything else away from this, we just hope that we can be a resource to you. I think I saw someone in the chat, this is their 3rd day on the job. We're so glad you're here. You're doing your job. You're doing your research right now. And so if you don't even know what to ask today, we're here and you can circle back. And so, yeah, I'm gonna launch in, but I just wanted to say that it is a journey to navigate this this whole new nonprofit world. So yeah, I'll talk about some options for research in the next slide, and Elizabeth kind of highlighted one of our community resources too, but a big piece of that research truly comes in the building relationships space and not being afraid to reach out to foundation or grant program specific staff. And I really wanted to highlight this interconnectedness between that building relationships. That's kind of that external piece of talking with those specific programs, and then this planning piece, which is more internal. I think every nonprofit would love to have unlimited resources and time for planning and getting everyone on the same page and really thinking big picture, long term. That just doesn't always happen the way you want it to. And so sometimes grants become that occasion to think about program planning or think about the goals that you have. It's not always ideal, but it often happens. That was definitely the case for my organization. Like, hello, we need outcomes. Can we talk about that? Because I have to answer a question about it. And so I just say that to say, if that's where you are, that's okay. And just if you are new to this role, that's a great question to ask. Like, who should I be talking about as I'm considering whether opportunities are a good fit for us or not? Is that program staff? Is that the executive director? And just getting those conversations started early. So you'll notice that the actual proposal itself is just this one yellow square of this bigger cycle. And so that research, building relationships, working with the organization, and then the stewardship piece, which we'll touch on in terms of keeping in touch with the donors and reporting back. That's all, it's a much bigger picture than just that literal grant proposal, which coming from a writing background, I was kind of sad to find, but we want to set that with you. You can go to the next slide. Awesome. And so, yes, every foundation, we just showed a handful on those past couple of slides, is unique with a different approach to giving. Sometimes there's really some big differences even between the folks on that board or that family and kind of their areas of expertise or what they're really hoping to fund at a particular time. And so that's why we really are going to focus somewhat on that relationship building piece so that you are actually getting the information you need to be competitive. That seeing if their mission is listed on their website, maybe they have pillars and some specific things they fund and don't fund. That's really that first level. And then we'll kind of talk about what it looks like to talk with us as staff or some other staff so that you can kind of go to that next level research. Cool. So these are some of those things to think about while you're starting to look at other foundation websites or just other grant programs. Is that kind of basic first level mission fit? And then if they are funding a specific geography area, so that's really going to be the case for the grant programs that the St. Louis Community Foundation is doing. But we kind of know that St. Louis Community can be kind of a different definition depending on the grant program. Nikki is our resident in the East Metro, and she's so good about bringing up all the important work that's taking place over there. And so if you just aren't sure about whether you're fit for an organization or a program, you can always reach out to us, but geography is just a really important filter to be paying attention to while you're looking. Again, going back to my experience in Minnesota, I was writing grants for 2 counties that didn't talk to each other a whole lot. Maybe you can relate. So just keeping those things in mind while you're doing your research. And then the target community, like the target population you're seeking to serve, is also really important. And you're doing this research and matching your program. And then I would say type of programming is maybe just critical to think about early on. So that would be, if you're looking to fund a brand new program, if you want to sustain your program, or if maybe your organization is in kind of a special project stage for like a capital expansion or capital campaign. A lot of funders really only focus on one of those things, or maybe a handful and not all of them. And so that can be really critical for coming up with an ask that will make sense for them. Even if the mission seems perfect, geography seems perfect, that type piece can be kind of a game changer. And that's where, their staff can really talk you through that too. And then, what your budget size is and what their budget size is, I'll talk about this a bit more too, is just helping scale your ask to be something that's competitive with that grant pool. And then just also, I would say thinking about who else is doing the work in these areas alongside of you or in partnership with you in your community. You can see past grant winners on a lot of foundation websites to get a sense of if you're kind of doing similar work. And I will say one of the things that I was really scared to do as a grant writer, but it ended up being really helpful, was reaching out to another organization to actually partner on a grant application. Actually a partner on a grant proposal, because we didn't have the mission fit or the type of programming, but we had the geography and target population. And so that ended up being really successful to apply for funding that we never would have been eligible for otherwise. And funders on any grant application will ask who you're working with. So just something to keep in mind early on as well. Okay, next slide. I feel like I'm just going to sound like a broken record, but it's kind of important. Truly, we welcome and encourage you to contact the foundation and program staff. We only are the program staff for a handful of grant programs, but we know some other funders and we think they're pretty great, and we think they'd like to talk to you as well. Just whatever their guidelines are, or their contact information is listed, just follow that as much as possible. It's effective to read as much as you can online so that you can come into that conversation with some ideas about your needs and what you would want funded. You'll just get better feedback that way, but don't let that scare you from reaching out. And this next point is just that as you're hearing feedback from the program staff and you're thinking about your own needs in your own organization, when you're really coming to that point of going for a grant, just thinking through whether those needs and activities fit in your organization's bigger strategy. We don't want you to get a gift that keeps on taking, is how some people talk about grants. We want the grant to actually feel like a win long-term and make sense for your work. And so that's also part of this right fit and right sizing, is having it make sense for your capacity and where your organization is at. There could be another phase of a project that makes more sense. And so those are all kind of ways to slice and dice a proposal. You can ask about what the typical grant types have been for the funding or a particular program you're interested in, whether that's general operating or program or project or capital. And you can ask about typical grant sizes too. It might vary by the program how much information that they can give, but all of that will help you in crafting a proposal that makes sense. And most importantly, anything that you do learn, take notes if you forgot something. Try to keep, ask it again so that you have it in hand for when you go to write the proposal, because it really shows if you heard the feedback or not. And then all of this is just to help you as you're doing the research, make sure that you're investing your time wisely. We've talked to organizations where writing a grant isn't the best next step for them. They're doing really successful in other fundraising efforts, and it just didn't make sense. There are some, a brand new nonprofit that's coming to me. I'm not going to tell them to go after a federal grant. It just doesn't make sense. That's the most extreme example, but as much as possible, we want you to walk away with an understanding of whether it's worth your time. Yeah, next slide. So for building relationships, and this is specific to our team, but we think they're just generally pretty good, good guidelines. Email or call us, ask specific questions about the grant program that you're interested in, invite us to learn more about your organization and provide that general information, because maybe we'll have something that we're thinking about that we can help share with you beyond even what you propose to us. We want to be a resource. If we don't end up being the right fit, we want to be a resource to you as much as possible. That said, we are in a lot of meetings, so don't email and phone the exact same day. We absolutely will get back to you. And if you are having specific questions about one program or one cycle, as much as possible, just don't leave the questions until the last minute. We don't say that to be punitive, we just might not get to you in time, and want to make sure we have time to help you make a good decision and write a good grant. And if you send us a lot of information, we will look at it. We will actually try as much as possible to get it to other team members, but we won't send you immediate feedback on anything. Yeah, and all of this is just to make sure that we can even help with the technical assistance side of things too. So yeah. And as you go to the next slide, I will say, again, going back to my experience, maybe I'm the only one, but I was really scared to reach out to my community foundation because I just didn't feel like I had all of the knowledge I was supposed to. And I just would say, if you're feeling that way, please still reach out to us. We really love nonprofits and we want you to do well. So just throwing that out there. Okay, so actually preparing to write your grant. Again, you've already been moving towards this point. You are ensuring your proposal aligns with the mission and priorities of the funder. Draw upon that feedback that you got when you talked to the program staff. You know, we were kind of laughing about this the other day, you know, for some, I think nonprofits sometimes think that everybody wants a pilot program, and a lot of our funders, that's not something they're particularly interested in. So we were just kind of helping someone think through, is this an expansion of your program? Are you actually carrying forth like what you've already been doing? How do we talk about this so that it really makes sense in this ask? And so if there's those keywords or just key considerations that you get from conversation, really use it at this moment. This is what you've been building towards. So clearly define the needs you're trying to meet. And I threw in really think about the opportunities that you're leveraging too. We're aware that a lot of grant stuff is needs or deficit focused sometimes. And we just want to encourage you that if there's a really exciting opportunity or partnership or just strengths of the folks that you're working with, to incorporate that into what is typically going to be called a needs assessment as well. We recognize that's just a direction of growing, and some of our applications will start to reflect that. Some of them will still be the Missouri Common Grant, which we'll get to, but just wanted to acknowledge that. Yeah, and then as you're thinking about your programs, again, grant writing can sometimes be that occasion to do research or do planning that otherwise your organization just may not get to prioritize. So use this as a chance to research those best practices and describe how, or, you know, to describe the kind of feedback you've gotten from your community and how that's impacted your work. Just create a good case for why you do what you do. And then as much as possible, make the outcomes concrete. I know I've seen some questions in the chat about kind of looking for the difference between numeric outcomes or telling stories. And I think this is just a really key area where we truly mean be honest about where you are, which might be on a later slide, but outcomes, that we know that takes a lot of investment to create the surveys or work with an outside research group to get concrete outcomes and not analyzing those pieces. And so whatever you have, whatever kind of feedback, whether that's conversations, notes from interactions, just think about the pieces you do already have in place and how you could tell a story, whether it's numbers or literally tell a story in that grant application. And also I think that that's, you know, a good, if you are going to take that step, contact the program staff. That could be a good area of kind of chatting through as well. And then really important, if you've gotten that information about the kind of awards, the range of awards, you really want to scale your request to fit the funder and fit that particular application. And check and recheck the budget. This is something that unfortunately at the end of grant applications, you see all of these questions and then there's like a little attachment, attach the budget button. that is not an accurate reflection of the time that it can take to get all of the people who have all of the eyes on the budget and get that in shape and matching the rest of the application. So if I could, I would move it to the top. Just leave enough time for that, especially if you're working with multiple organizations. That will take some time to coordinate. Next slide. Cool. So just some basic guidelines. Follow the instructions as much as possible. It kind of links to a couple bullet points down. Just answer the question that is asked and no more. You don't have to fill up every single word count. And if you kind of look at, the whole grant application ahead of time and map out your answers to the questions, someone asked about incorporating more some stories within the word counts. If you kind of do the basic answer as much as possible, that'll give you a sense of where there's some space to throw in a story. Oftentimes probably in that client description piece or the impact piece, just to kind of round out the snapshot of your organization that you're getting. And then just going back, be transparent and tell us where you're at. I think that is really important in that outcomes piece. There's more questions, kind of we hear from other funders and we hear from other nonprofits. There are more questions around equity and just other organization policies in place. If where you are at in your work is you have a committee formed around some goal and you expect that in 6 months you'll have something in place, that's an okay thing to put. You don't have to make anything up, please don't. Just be transparent. And also kind of within this, again, it's just included as an attachment at the bottom, but your budget actually tells a big part of your story. We've seen applications where the budget makes it, the budget shows that the project and program is completely funded. Whether that was a mistake or accurate, it's kind of hard for us as a funding decision when there's limited resources to go around. So just making sure that your budget lines up with whatever you said the need is, whatever you said the committed resources are. And again, sometimes that is more time consuming than even those questions. So building that into your planning. Next slide. There might be more than one person in your organization working on a grant. So assign a lead writer or someone who will make sure they can standardize that voice. And then be able to kind of come up with some standard things that you can draw upon so that you can copy and paste a bit. And then with your extra, with your more intensive focus being around using that research, those conversations to individualize pieces of the proposal. And edit, we know you're doing that, but yeah, just a reminder. I think I'm handing this off now, is that right? To Nikki, okay, cool.
Mute myself so I can talk about the Missouri Common Grant application, which is everyone's favorite topic on a beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Missouri Common Grant application. If you are new to grant writing, buckle up because it's a lot of fun. It can be lengthy. Like we are definitely not. We don't sugarcoat that. It's quite a lengthy application, and it is meant to take you through an entire logic model of your organization. We have definitely seen a lot of our funders move away from using the full Missouri Common Grant application, particularly when they're funding year after year, considering renewal funding. They won't ask that organization to fill out all of the same information again and repeat themselves over and over. But that being said, it's still important to familiarize yourself with it for several reasons. One, even if it's not the whole application, it is probably the foundation of any application you're gonna encounter. More than likely, the questions that you're going to be answering will be pulled straight from that Missouri Common Grant. And it is important to kind of understand the context of all of those questions. And one of the things we talk about all the time about it is if you feel like you're repeating yourself, you probably are. And it can be a little confusing because the questions can only, are in some cases very similar. They are asking different things from that logic model perspective. But again, it can be a little bit confusing. So we always encourage you to go back, and if you feel like you're saying too much, answering a little bit less in that case, but making sure all of the information you're trying to pull together is there. This is also a really awesome chance to perfect that language and those boilerplates that you will be using across various grants. Obviously, I always say grants are very similar to resumes and cover letters. You're going to customize that to whatever job you're trying to get. But at the same time, it's not like my resume is going to completely change. It's not like I'm all of a sudden going to become, an astrophysicist. I'm still a social worker. All of that information is still very much the same. And there is an opportunity to use that same language. But we do encourage you to make sure that you're just making sure it fits with what that funder is looking for. But there is a lot of potential to cut and paste with an application. I always say the mark of a good grant, or it's not the mark of a bad grant writer to cut and paste some of your questions. It's actually the mark of somebody that understands their organization and has developed that language. But again, just be very cautious that you're making sure that that still fits with that particular application. The Missouri Common Grant budget. You will see this template all over. Even if they are not linking directly to the Missouri Common Grant budget, very often funders will use this template because it is comprehensive and it's pretty standardized. So it's very easy for them to move things across different grant opportunities. I can't express this enough. List everything. If you have to add rows to this budget, please do. I look at a lot of budgets and immediately can say, I know that you were funded by XYZ Foundation because we've had this conversation, but they're not on your budget. Like, I know you got this funding from us like 6 months ago, but they're not on your budget. I think sometimes there's a lot of disconnect, and it's important to incorporate the team effort into putting that budget together. You can customize the categories to fit your needs. Those other categories or adding in extra foundations or whatever it might be. Generally, these are not rows or columns that are locked down, and you do have options to customize, and that's not a problem. Check that your numbers match your other sections where you're describing your need. This is so important. We often get budgets that just don't match what the actual request is within the application, and it sounds pretty simple, but it can be a lot of work for us to go back and figure out where you're at. And using your narrative to give further explanations. This is so important in terms of funding restrictions and pending funding, I think, because you have to understand that very much like our donors are more than likely, these are folks that, if it's a private or family foundation, they probably made money in the for-profit industry. We're all in nonprofit. I don't have enough money to establish a private family foundation. So they don't necessarily understand the workings of those funding restrictions or things on a day-to-day. And it is important for them to understand that. And it's something that we are constantly pointing out to them, but it can be helpful if you give that information in your own words. I think a great example of that is, we have a lot of organizations that get federal funding, and it looks like, oh my gosh, they got $1 million. They are fine. They don't need my money, but we know that that's not the case. We know that federal funding will not cover certain things that you need to cover in order to keep your doors open. We know that that's happening, and it is important for those donors to understand that yes, on paper, we got $1 million. The Post-Dispatch reported on it. It's amazing. We're so excited about it, but it's only the beginning, and it actually creates some gaps for us, and we need other funders to jump in and fill those in.
Can I jump in here? And there was a question in the chat about overhead, and you can throw on to, or you'll see on the Missouri budget, Missouri Common Grant application budget template, that administration line, that's where you put your overhead dollars in, or if your organization breaks them out by category, you can break them out by category up above, right? The important thing, I think, as you're thinking about the admin percentage, is that when we look at that, when we look to see, and we'll look at your audits to figure out what that admin percentage is, We recognize that you need money to be able to run your organization. If you're at 75% overhead, then we're going to raise an eyebrow. But we try to work within the United Way's sort of range that goes up to 35% for admin and fundraising. So, just as we've been saying all along, be transparent, be open, be honest, and don't try to hide. But if you need to explain something, like we made a big growth, a big investment in our capital growth, then just tell us that so that we know what we're looking at. Okay, back to Nikki, and we've got less than 5 minutes left.
Yes, but we will definitely get to all of your questions. I won't go too far into this. I think we've really reiterated the importance of being concrete and being honest and communicating with your funder and really telling your story about what your impact looks like. That's what reporting once you get funded will look like. Sorry. Ongoing relationships, this can be difficult, we always recommend asking the grant maker the best way to steward that funder. We know our funders well. We really consider them to almost be like family, and we learn how they like to do this sort of work. And some of them, we joke, they like to be fed all the time. They just love information. They will read any update that you send to us and we send to them. And in some cases, they say, we want to put all of our updates in the trustees binder and we will read them once a quarter. We have some that love to go to events. We have some that will never, ever be able to make it to your events. But, ask us. We will be honest with you about the best way to continue that relationship. Send us electronic updates because they're not only important to that funder, they're helpful for us to learn the landscape of your work in general. It's helpful for us to be able to report back to our other colleagues about what's happening. And it's not just about that one grant. That relationship with us is also important. And extend invitations to events. Even if our funders can't come, we very often will come to represent them, or we are asked very specifically to come and represent them. And that is part of our job and part of coming together with you and really understanding the work. Linda, anything that is new or exciting for your organization would be an update. If you feel it's new and exciting, some people have a regular quarterly newsletter. Some people just will send out something when there's a specific campaign going on. Whatever that is that's important to you, we want to know if that's something that's going to affect your work for sure. Things not to do. We actually had a long discussion about spending money on gifts because gifts can be very kind of sneaky, like a signed poster from a play that a donor supported might be considered a thank you card, but it might not be if it's been put into a $500 frame. It might be fine if you had a big donor event where all of your donors were invited to see a preview of that play, but it might not be appropriate to just give free tickets to your donor. We recommend just being very, very cautious about this and having very clear boundaries about and talking to us about it for sure. Don't argue with us. We want to help you. We're definitely here to do that, and we don't want to have that in any animosity. Definitely don't try to circumvent the process by going to the trustees. They pay us to be their gatekeepers. They're busy people and they are engaged in this work and excited about it, but they don't necessarily have the time to do it on the day-to-day, and that's what we're here to do. Don't just copy and paste from last year's without updating it. We will notice. It's really helpful. We want to see those updates. And I can't express this enough. Please do not wait until the last minute. I get this all the time. The other day, I literally got a call or an email at 8 o'clock. I had a doctor's appointment at 9 a.m. the next morning, and this person wanted something by 10 that morning. I was like, how am I even going to do that? Like, I took the morning off. So it's very, very difficult for us to respond last minute. We will help you, but we're human too. Okay, we've come to the end, and I know we're right at time, but we want to make sure that we've answered all of the questions that have come up. So I'm going to go through the list.
There are two that just came up in the chat, and I was starting to write, but I think I'll do orally then. One is Linda Mitchell. Hi, Linda. Asked what's an update, and I would consider any kind of noteworthy change or new program or huge result from an ongoing program that you're particularly proud of is something worth sharing with your funders. And as Nikki said, some funders want to hear that on an ongoing basis. Others want the quarterly digest, right? So getting to know who likes to hear how is an important thing. The Foundation for Black Foundations is not something that I'm familiar with. I don't know if Emily or Nikki or anyone else on the call today or on the Zoom today knows that organization. So
I'm not familiar with them. I am familiar with several Black Foundation organizations that are specifically around Black foundations or organizations that are funding the Black community, but I'm not familiar with them. And then Marie had a question about who uses the Missouri Common Grant. It really depends on the funder. It very much depends on the funder and what they're looking for from that application. I can't say specifically what type of funder will look for that Missouri Common Grant, like the whole thing. It's really about them picking and choosing the questions that they want answered. And we pore over those questions with our donors to make sure, one, that they are getting all the information that they need, and two, that application is not too long for the amount of funding that will result in it. I think the Jaffe Charitable Fund is a great example of that. They're doing grants around $5,000, and the length of their application reflects that, because we would never ask you to fill out an entire Missouri Common Grant application for $5,000. And that's part of our job, to advise our donors to say, that's not within their capacity. This is something that you have to understand about right sizing your ask in addition to expectations about the ask. That makes sense.
There's another question about grant software or donor software that we'd recommend. There's so many different programs out there, and they shift and change and all the rest. I mean, like for years, Donor Perfect was great, and then it was not so great, and now people were liking it again. And I don't feel comfortable being able to recommend one over the other. That might be a great question to ask at AFP, where you've got people who are much more up to date on. AFP is the Association for Fundraising Professionals, the St. Louis chapter. Then you've got people who might be more up to date on what the current best software is.
We had one question in the chat about applying for funding when you're serving the undocumented. So obviously that can be a challenge. For our funding, because our funding is private, generally there are not restrictions on that. It really depends on the grant. It really depends on that, the process and who has put funds in. Obviously, if you're applying for any federal or state funding, it's going to be a lot more restricted in that case. I think the only one that we had specific restrictions on may have been the Welcome Fund, to focus more up on specific people that we're settling within the community, and not necessarily exclusionary, but more that we wanted to prioritize very specific populations.
Actually, I think with the Welcome Fund, it was really for the first year, people working with individuals new to St. Louis in their first year who were refugees or asylum seekers. So, and again, as Nikki said, it's usually public funders that that will restrict. Each individual grantor will do sort of what they want, but that's been our experience. Linda, you asked, do grantors give you less than you requested? Yes, they will. Sometimes that's because they want to fund part of the request, but not the whole request. Sometimes it's recently we had a situation where we had over $1 million of requests for, with about $200 worth of funding to distribute. And so rather than say no completely, the funder decided to, or the trustees of that organization decided to give smaller grants to some organizations. What we recommend is that that they look at that budget, and if a smaller grant means that you can't move forward with a new project, then it's better to not give it all than to give partially. So anyway.
We had another question about new nonprofits, and if you're not able to give years of income and expenses, and that's okay. We actually talked to a new organization about this with Charles just the other day. They are brand new as of this year, and all they have is their current income statements and their projected budget, and that's what they will be uploading. And in the other areas where there are uploads required, say for an audit or something like that, we've asked that they upload an explanation of why they aren't able to provide those documents, just so that we just a simple 2-sentence Word document, we aren't able to do this because we were just established 8 months ago. And that I think will be sufficient for our advisory committee and for our team to understand where the organization's at, because again, that's the most important thing for us, is for us to know where you're at. Very social worky of us. We want to meet you where you are. And if that means that you're new, then you're new. And that might look a little bit different for you. We might look at your capacity building or, shorter term funding to sort of get you on your feet. So we'll definitely work with that in most grant cases. And if it's not an appropriate grant for a new organization, we'll let you know. If we think that a funder is not likely to fund something that's not been, established long term, we will most definitely be transparent about that, so you don't waste your time. Because again, we've all written grants, so we don't want to waste your time. I think that is the biggest takeaway from this today, is that we empathize and sympathize with the work that you do and respect it so much, and that and making sure that you are able to do the best job possible is such an important part of our job. Yes,
Sarah, I'm looking at it's Grant Professionals Association. I'm going to put the link in the chat.
Yes, absolutely. If you want to connect and talk shop, so to speak, Sarah, please let us know. We are very familiar with Arch City, and we're always happy to have a updated conversation. Because like we said, like our role is not just about reading grants and running these grant making processes. We are the eyes and ears of the rest of our community foundation team. It is part of our job to be out in the community, just knowing what's happening and having our finger on the pulse of what those needs are. So, even if we're not appropriate to write that check, we want to have the conversation with you so we can be a resource.
And I am correcting myself in the chat. It's the Grant Professionals Association. And it's www.stlewisgpa.org.
Any other questions? I'm still monitoring the chat, but it looks like we've got to everything.
Okay, well then I think we'll sign off. But again, we are so thankful that you attended today, and we welcome you to reach out as you need to. And we're happy to talk anytime.
And stay tuned for more presentations. We're also excited to do a little bit more of this work.
Yes, October 25th. We forgot to mention that. On October 25th, we're doing a session on how to work with the St. Louis Community Foundation. So if you haven't signed up yet, Emily Bauman will send another reminder a little closer to the date. But we'd love to see you at that session as well.
Yep, Elizabeth, that's correct. It's also going to be at the bottom of the email tomorrow, in which we'll be sending out the link to this recording as well as the PDF of your great presentation. So keep an eye out in your inbox. All right, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and end the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to my wonderful teammates for such a great presentation, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, enjoy the weather.